Since ancient times, even the moon goddess Chang'e favored the young. He had to sell his face for a good price before his youth faded away. He drank her wine and climbed into her car. "Please give me a chance. I'm clean." Everyone knew how Lee Mian had landed a job at this university. The last working day before the holiday break was a cocktail of excitement and apprehension. Some staff vanished without a trace, while others were little more than empty shells, lazily clacking away at their keyboards. Lee Mian wasn't among them. The sound of an empty milk teacup echoed, followed by a voice garbled by pearls.
"Where's Lee Mian?"
"Left already." Another voice answered immediately, someone lounging with legs splayed and wearing Crocs. "He's with the administrative office." Time to renew his contract again? He should finally get the boot this time. 5 years, no research, not a single paper published. The one with the milk tea snorted. Do they think every leader is going to be enchanted by his face? "It's not every leader," a calm voice interjected. Lee Mian stood by the door. The milk tea holder flushed crimson, stunned into silence. The Crocs wearer forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. "So, how many years did they renew you for?" Lee Mian walked to his desk, smiling faintly. "Just as you all wished. Isn't that great?" His words were strong, but his steps were unsteady. His outer shell held firm, but inside, he was crumbling to pieces. Lee Mian sat down, absently twisting the rubber grip on his pen over and over, his whole body tense as if he were strangling a mortal enemy. Everyone wanted to see him fail, and the joke was on him. He was the biggest fool of all. When Shen Honglu left the university, everyone knew before he did. He had been clueless, though the looks from those around him had shifted, no longer tinged with envy but with giddy anticipation, even malice. He hadn't understood at the time. Not until that last meeting at the hotel. Shen Honglu had been carefully retouching her makeup, masking the first signs of aging. He had embraced her from behind, pressing his face to hers. She had raised a hand to stroke his youthful skin, sighing wistfully as she told him she was leaving. In the mirror, he had seen someone stunned and pale. He knew then that he had lost to her ambitions. Shen Honglu had once said, "To achieve what men with equal qualifications take for granted, women must be doubly ruthless, doubly inhuman, before others will bow their heads." He was merely a part of her humanity. A mirror at his workstation reflected Lee Mian's ashen face. Yet he was still not bad-looking. Earlier, a friend had confided bluntly, "Times have changed. Even foreign-educated PhDs are scrambling for third-rate teaching positions. And you, let's be honest, you're unskilled. Shen Honglu pulled strings for you in grad school, and even your thesis wasn't your own. If you had to rely on yourself, you'd starve. My advice? Stick to your strengths. Why move when you don't have to?" Lee Mian had asked. "What do you mean?" His friend had smiled knowingly. "Your face. Women still like it." He slid a business card across the desk. Lee Mian glanced at the name, Tan Guxing. "The new dean," his friend continued. "Single. Do your best. Get a proper title from her. That way, the school can openly secure your position. Don't let it end like Shen Honglu, free use and then thrown away when things got inconvenient." Pushing him toward the door, the friend had clapped him on the shoulder. "Men can live off their looks these days. You should be grateful. Youth doesn't last forever, and you've only got a month left at this job. Think it over." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Lee Mian in a vast, echoing corridor filled with a sense of desolation that seeped into every corner. In his hand, a business card, his last lifeline. He didn't know her, but he was already destined to flatter and court her, to offer himself up to her. He realized, with a pang of shame, that he was nothing more than a prostitute. Before the holiday, as usual, there was a staff dinner. The new leader wanted to get to know her subordinates. Lee Mian arrived half an hour early per the administrative notice, yet somehow, he was still the last one there. The only seat left was near the serving area, usually reserved for the younger newcomers to the unit. The young woman sitting there smiled at him, but didn't stand to offer her seat. The others teased him, saying he owed a penalty drink. Mian steadied himself, raised his glass, and bowed slightly toward the head of the table. Dean Tan, I got caught in traffic. My apologies. He drank 3 cups in a row before Tan Guxin responded indifferently. I've heard about you, from Dean Shin. No worries, please sit. Mian felt a wave of heat and cold rise from the back of his head, spreading through his entire body. Someone beside him handed him cutlery, but all they had was a pair of disposable chopsticks, one of which was slightly damaged, with a blackened, shriveled end. The bright porcelain plate reflected the chandelier's light. He stared at the glint, feeling the world around him grow darker.
She knows everything.
What had Shun Honglu said about him? A trophy? A plaything? A lover? His reputation was already ruined. He hadn't even begun his career and was already halfway defeated. The atmosphere at the table was lively. Tan Guxin wasn't the type of leader to withhold jokes, but Mian couldn't eat. He felt as though his body was expanding, his limbs unable to find a place. Any slight movement would draw the curious, mocking eyes of others. The alcohol in his stomach gradually began to take effect. Mian stood up but accidentally bumped into a server. Half a pot of hot soup spilled onto his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, forced a smile, and backed out of the room. At the sink, he hastily unbuttoned his shirt and rinsed himself repeatedly with cold water. Did it burn you? In the mirror, another figure appeared. Tan Guxin was washing her hands, slowly wiping them with a paper towel. Her hair swayed slightly, revealing an earring that flickered in and out of view. He saw it clearly. It was Van Cleef and Arpel's signature design with 3 tiny heart-shaped flowers, worth around 60,000 yuan. In a low voice, Mian replied, Thank you, Dean. I'm fine. Instinctively, he turned slightly, showing her his profile, the angle where his face looked best. Just as he was about to speak, his phone rang abruptly. His father's loud voice came through. How much money do you have? Your mom fell on the mountain today and broke her left leg. She's in the hospital now. The doctor says the bone is cracked and she needs surgery. Mian hurriedly ended the call, then turned apologetically to Tan Guxin. My family situation isn't good. Sorry for letting you see this. Tan Guxin hadn't left. She was leaning against the sink, casually smoking. With a faint smile, she glanced at him. I understand. A sick mother, a gambling father, a sister still in school, and a broken man. The standard package. He felt insulted, but had nowhere to vent his frustration. Instead, he looked at her with a hint of pain. But I'm telling the truth. Tan Guxin let out a short laugh. The truth. She pressed her cigarette against the edge of the sink. The heat met the cold water with a sharp hiss. A thin wisp of smoke, like a reluctant ghost, lingered. Mian gave a bitter smile. Is that how she described me? Tan Guxin replied. She said a lot more. Want to hear it? Mian shook his head. No need. Tan Guxin left. As the tension subsided, the pain set in. Buttoning up his shirt, he wandered down the stairs, lost. The alcohol hit him hard. In the parking lot, he leaned against a black car and fell asleep. A small part of him held onto a desperate wish. If the driver didn't notice him and ran him over, at least he wouldn't die a jobless bum. It would be dignified. But someone shook him awake. Groggy, he tried to brush them off, but they persisted. He finally opened his eyes and saw Tan Guxin looking down at him with a faint smile. You really don't give up, she said. Her sharp heels tapped impatiently against the ground. Using a bit more force, she added, Get up. Dazed, he looked up at her. You've been drinking. You shouldn't drive. That's none of your business, she retorted. He stood up and opened the car's back door for her. She sat upright in the shadows while he remained exposed under the bright parking lot lights. There was nowhere to hide, and the light seemed to make him transparent, a crystal figure with all his flaws laid bare. He caught a strong whiff of alcohol from her. Suddenly, Mian leaned into the car, squeezing into the narrow space near the footwell. Trembling, with desperation in his voice, he pleaded, "Please, give me a chance." He knew how he looked at that moment, his snow-white skin, crimson lips, tearful almond-shaped eyes. Tan Guxin, as if bewitched, reached out to caress his face. He immediately rested his cheek in her palm, his skin warm and smooth. Her fingers moved to his lips, smudging the red along the corner of his mouth. For a long moment, he raised his tearful eyes to meet hers directly. "I'm clean," he said. "Dean Shen, she makes me get blood tests every 4 months." Tan Guxin leaned back heavily against the seat, closing her eyes as if feigning sleep. She spoke coldly. "Get in." Yi Mian stood barefoot on the thick, plush carpet, his feet almost swallowed by it. Looking down, he felt like a primitive man cutting through underbrush, searching for prey. Tan Guxin was asleep. He saw the mirror in the bathroom and couldn't resist practicing. Gazing at it with tender emotion, the reflection returned a wistful look. Then he smiled, bitterly, with nothing to his name. To others, he was an excuse, but for Yi Mian, this was his life. Yet he was fortunate to have a face like this. It had always been like this. He was 19 and a half when he got involved with Shen Honglu, not yet a student at this university. But he was too beautiful. There were even talent scouts who tried to recruit him, but that path was too long. He couldn't wait. He needed money, immediately, now, at once. Behind him was a bottomless pit filled with the flames of hell. Throwing in wads of cash made no sound. It burned away faster than skipping stones. He had thought it was just a temporary measure. But as time passed, he became addicted, unable to leave the embrace of these women, like a bird embroidered on someone's screen, brilliant and dazzling, but when he turned to look, his wings were already mildewed and decayed. "This body is all I have left." Yi Mian returned from washing up and lay down on the carpet beside the bed, fully dressed. Sleep wouldn't come. The enormous moon peeked through the gap in the curtains. So big and round, an eternal eye, coldly observing. Anxiety suddenly overwhelmed him. Half the month was gone, 1 month after another. Like knots on a rope, they seemed so close. But running toward them felt like a game. And yet, this segmented life had slipped too far away. He held his face in his hands. He couldn't age, not yet. Not now. He stayed there for 3 nights, always sleeping on the carpet, like a dog, one without a tail. On the last night, Tan Guxin's hand dangled from the bed. He obediently massaged her wrist until she woke up, struggling to open her eyes. "Did the university tell you they wouldn't renew your contract?" she asked. Yi Mian nodded. "Yes. Not renewing is for the best. You're not suited to be a lecturer. I don't know how Shen Honglu managed to keep you around." His heart sank, shocked into silence. His tongue froze, leaving his hands mechanically kneading her wrist. It was only now that he noticed how cold her hand was, as if it had no blood. He was too young, too inexperienced to deal with this kind of blow. He didn't yet understand that some people could devour others without leaving a trace. Tan Guxin withdrew her hand and turned over sleepily. "Start with an administrative role. When the next unified exam comes, I'll arrange a position for you. You'll get into the civil service system." His ears heard the words instantly, but it took him a long time to process their meaning. The joy of surviving disaster flooded through him, a life-altering moment in a single breath. Panting, he couldn't help but compare Tan Guxin to Shen Honglu. His heart suddenly felt a strange ache. He had truly fallen in love with her. When Yi Mian returned to work, he was assigned a new office. Seeing pearl milk tea and holy sandals around, he felt a hint of doubt but hesitated to test the waters or probe too much. While he lingered, unsure of whether to act, a property staff member knocked on the door and entered. "Mr. Yi, Dean Tan is in a hurry for a meeting. Her car wasn't parked properly, and she asked if you could move it for her." Yi Mian nodded, saying, "I'll take care of it." He knew that behind him, someone was probably cursing him under their breath, mocking him as a toy of an older woman. Yet, despite the ridicule, they would begrudgingly admire his ability to cozy up to 2 successive deans. Some would even drop their ugly expressions from yesterday, shifting to a new, insincere respect. It's a common human failing to despise the circumstances but begrudgingly admire success. Tan Guxin's car, like her persona, was simple to the point of coldness, revealing no hint of its owner's preferences. After parking her car, Mian felt a gaze on him, one so intense it seemed to bore 2 holes into his back. He turned to look, but all he saw were people hurrying by, with nothing particularly suspicious. Later, Tan Guxin messaged him to return the car keys. When he entered her office, there was already someone there. Mian placed the keys on her desk and turned to leave, but a voice called out, "Mr. E." The first thing he noticed were the speaker's eyes. White sclera so prominent they made the irises seem unnaturally bright, their cold gleam unnerving. "Mr. E," the person repeated, forcing Mian to respond. "And you are?" "I'm one of Dean Tan's students," the man replied, introducing himself as Guan. "I'm currently pursuing a doctorate under her guidance. I've long heard of Mr. Yi's reputation. Brilliant on the outside and famous far and wide. Meeting you today, I see the rumors weren't exaggerated." Brilliant on the outside, the words dripped with malice. Feigning a polite smile, Mian replied nothing. But he couldn't help sizing up Guan, a well-groomed appearance with slicked-back hair shining faintly from too much gel. He wore a nearly white, pale gray dress shirt with rolled-up sleeves that deliberately showed off muscular arms. Mian turned to Tan Guxin, asking casually, "Dean Tan, do you need something moved from your office?" Tan Guxin glanced up from her screen with a puzzled look.
No.
Mian laughed lightly. "Guan seems ready to lend a hand. I thought you might need his help moving something heavy." Tan Guxin responded flatly. "If he wants to, there are 2 fiddle-leaf fig trees the property office still hasn't delivered." Both men ended up each carrying 1 large tree. The elevator went up to the 26th floor, leaving them with no choice but to use the stairs. Guan started walking ahead but turned back, smiling. "Don't keep Dean Tan waiting too long, Mr. E." As they climbed side by side, Mian noticed Guan's profile, prominent features, deep-set eyes, and a fashionable tan that suggested leisurely outdoor activities rather than hard labor. The kind of look that screamed privilege. "You don't seem like someone who exercises much, Mr. E," Guan remarked. "If this is too heavy, don't overdo it, you might hurt your back." Mian simply smiled. "You're overthinking it," Guan continued. "I've been working under Dean Tan since my master's degree. She's been incredibly supportive, even encouraging me to pursue a doctorate under her guidance. It's been 7 or 8 years now." Mian cut him off. "You have hair gel on your ear." Guan blinked. "What?" At the next landing, Mian stopped, turned and said, deadpan, "Guan, a word of advice. Don't push too hard. You'll hurt yourself." Fiddle-leaf figs aren't easy to care for. Over time, Mian noticed that one tree thrived while the other gradually wilted. Though minor, it gnawed him. He often wondered, which one had he carried? He hoped it was the healthier one. Mian performed well in his administrative duties, despite Guan's frequent provocations. During a faculty meeting, for instance, Guan meddled with the sound equipment, causing all the microphones to malfunction mid-session. While Tan Guxin was left unable to speak, Guan leapt up to resolve the issue, fixing the equipment before Mian could. Mian hadn't expected such a juvenile move. Instead of anger, he felt amusement. Later, as Tan Guxin left the stage, Guan rushed ahead to greet her. "Dean Tan." "Professor Tan." She merely nodded, her expression indifferent as she walked past both men. Guan lingered to throw a final jab. "Mr. E really should be more careful. Such a basic mistake." Before Mian could respond, Guan made a grand exit, citing another class. Left alone with Tan Guxin, Mian followed her to the parking lot, getting into the passenger seat. As she drove, Tan Guxin remarked idly. His mother and mine go way back. He had an older brother close to my age who died in an accident when we were kids. He was born afterward, so his family's always been protective of him. They keep asking me to look out for him, always mentioning how their lineage ties back to the Qing dynasty's Gualjia clan. Hard not to pick up a bit of arrogance with that upbringing. Are you explaining this to me?
Yi Mian asked.
Tan Guxin chuckled. I'm telling you not to provoke him. Otherwise, he'll go crying to my mother, and I'll have to clean up the mess. Yi Mian knew she saw through everything, yet chose to stay uninvolved. Bitterness welled up in his chest, but when he opened his mouth to speak, no words came. Their relationship wasn't intimate enough for him to act jealous or petulant. He bit the inside of his cheek, the pain grounding him. Childhood sweethearts? He asked, unable to resist. Tan Guxin shot him a cold glance, her lips curving into a faint smile. But her tone was icily detached when she replied with one word. Sweethearts. The single word sent a chill through his body. He wasn't her first. He had no right to tie her to anyone with a word like "to." The realization was like a slap, leaving him drenched in cold sweat. At a red light, Tan Guxin pointed to the glove compartment. There's a box. Open it. Inside was a watch, its face a deep emerald green with an engraved iceberg on the back. Beneath the ice, a small figure swam, resembling both a diver and a trapped soul seeking an escape. Happy birthday, she said. Yi Mian hesitated. It's too much. I don't think it's appropriate for me to wear something so expensive. She nodded lightly. Where do you live? Are you taking me home? He asked. She didn't answer, merely gesturing to the center console. Leave my office keys there if you still have them. Later, Wang Lu appeared in Guan Hashan's hand. His sleeves were not rolled up so high anymore, just enough to expose his wrist, highlighting the green of the lake distinctly. Moreover, he had developed a new habit, showing up at the administrative office every few days, causing the single female teachers to indulge in flights of fancy. Only Yi Mian saw it clearly. Every time Guan Hashan entered the room, he would lean on his desk with the arm that wore a watch, as if silently showing off. Tan Guxin slapped him, but gave him sweet dates. He didn't appreciate it, so naturally he was out.
He didn't want to.
But after having his keys taken away, he had now become one of those standing outside waiting. The door to Tan Guxin's office wasn't completely closed, and through the crack he could see 3 people inside, Guan Hashan, Tan Guxin, and another figure who looked a lot like Guan Hashan, probably his mother, judging by her age. Guan's mother said, Xiaoshan is about to graduate. His father, and I still think it would be good for him to stay at the school. He has a lot of personality flaws, and the environment here is simpler than the outside world. Tan Guxin responded, What do you think? Guan Hashan shook his head and didn't speak. His mother sighed deeply. This child has had it too easy. Growing up, whatever he wanted to do, his father and I did our best to pave the way for him. He never thought, once he leaves this small area, who would take him seriously? Tan Guxin replied, There's no need to rush on this. The school is right here. If necessary, he can gain some experience and come back later. A little comparison might be good. Guan's mother smiled. That's true. It's good for him to go out and meet more people. And if the opportunity arises, he might want to address his personal issues. You too, Xian, even if you don't plan to have children, you should get married. When you're old, you'll still have someone to rely on. Tan Guxin said, It's already 10:10, you see. I have a meeting soon. Yi Mian hadn't expected Guan Hashan to act so quickly. As soon as Tan Guxin's words fell, the door opened suddenly, and the two almost collided. Guan Hashan stepped back with distaste, mocking. Teacher Yi, is there a bus stop here? What are you doing, waiting by the door? Yi Mian answered calmly. I came to deliver the speech for the meeting to Tan Yuan. Tan Guxin said, Hand it over. This time, even if Guan's mother's bottom were glued to the sofa with super glue, she still had to get up to leave. When the room was empty, Tan Guxin leaned on the sofa, her face weary. Right on time. Mian walked directly to the coffee table, threw the cup used by Guan's mother into the trash can, wiped his hands with a wet tissue, knelt on one knee on the sofa, and gently massaged her temples. Tan Guxin relaxed, sighing. "You're quite perceptive. How did you know I was bothered by her?" Mian didn't respond immediately. After a while, he whispered, "Tan Yuan." Tan Guxin replied, Mian said, "I was wrong." Tan Guxin said nothing, just gave a cold laugh. Mian continued massaging her, gradually lowering himself until he was kneeling at her feet, repeating, "Tan Yuan, I was wrong. I wasn't thinking clearly and made you angry." Tan Guxin asked, "What was there to not understand?" Mian said, "It's nothing." After a pause, he added, "He is your student now, and it doesn't matter what happens after. I'm your dog." Tan Guxin said, "You still know he's my student?" There was a knock on the door, and from the sound, it was Guan Hashan. Tan Guxin waved her hand and said to Mian, "You can leave now." Mian didn't move. When he saw her return to the desk, he followed her. Tan Guxin asked, "Do you still have something to say?" Mian replied, "You said, what does he still need to tell you?" Guan Hashan knocked again. Tan Guxin, irritated, said, "What does it matter to you what he says?" Mian whispered, "Can I listen?" Tan Guxin took a deep breath and relented. "You stay by the door and listen." Mian said, "The dog wants to follow the owner." He knelt down, and under her surprised gaze, crawled under the desk. Tan Guxin had no choice but to silently warn him to stay quiet with her eyes, and then she raised her voice. "Come in." It was Guan Hashan. Tan Guxin said blandly, "Sit over there." Guan Hashan urgently said, "Tan Yuan, Tan Guxin interrupted, "Your biggest task right now is to graduate. As for other things, they all come second. Don't think too far ahead." Guan Hashan mumbled something and buried his face in his hands, but Tan Guxin couldn't hear it. She had to divert her attention to Mian, who, having claimed to be a dog, was now curled up beside her legs under the desk. The space was too small. She accidentally stepped on his hand with her heel, but he didn't make a sound, just waiting for a chance to extend his hand, which was now marked with red spots from the pressure, like a silent animal. She got goosebumps. Mian had gradually realized that Tan Guxin was like a sugar person, a perfect outer shell covered in syrup, serious, indifferent, and smooth to the touch, but that was only for show. Inside, she harbored a smoldering fire, just waiting for a puff of air to turn it into a blaze. Guan Hashan said, "Tan Yuan, I don't want to trouble you, which is why I want to go out and try something for myself." Tan Guxin supported her forehead with both hands, her face hidden in the shadow of her arms. Her ears felt the sudden coolness of the air, and she didn't dare speak, only responding muffled. Guan Hashan suddenly stood up, but Tan Guxin stopped him. "Say it right there." Guan Hashan had no choice but to stand 3 steps away. "I know, if I stay at the school, I'll always be your student. I want to make something of myself, and when the time comes, I'll be able to proudly." Tan Guxin interrupted. "Get out." Guan Hashan, unaccustomed to being treated like this, froze, his mouth open in shock, urgently looking for an explanation. Tan Guxin finally slammed her fist on the desk and shouted hoarsely, "Get out." Her eyes were red, her eyes glistening with tears. A lock of hair slipped from her neatly styled bun, making her look unexpectedly seductive. Guan Hashan was
Stunned.
He stepped back slowly, exiting the room. The door clicked shut with a magnetic sound. Tan Guxin took a deep breath and called out, "Come out." Mian was kneeling by her feet, looking up at her with clear, innocent eyes. Tan Guxin, angered, raised her hand and slapped him. Mian turned his head, and immediately 5 finger marks appeared on his face like an embossed relief. Tan Guxin sneered. "You're quite delicate." Mian replied, "If I weren't delicate, how could I follow you around?" They reconciled, though perhaps reconciled wasn't quite the right word, but Lee Mi-on got his keys back. He was slightly bothered by the watch, but after a few days, he noticed Kwon Haeshan wasn't wearing it anymore. He had replaced it with a smartwatch, and his sleeves now completely covered his wrist. Lee Mi-on guessed that Tan Gushin must have had another conversation with Kwon Haeshan, and now the man no longer caused him any trouble. But they still lived next door to each other. This was something he discovered only after moving into Tan Gushin's home. Now, he really was a bird in a golden cage. He brought in his belongings, only for Tan Gushin to order him to throw everything out. He discarded all traces of his former life, cleaned up, and sat on the carpet, peeling a crispy persimmon. He looked up with a smile and asked, "Do you want some?" The main light in the room wasn't on. Only the projector was showing a movie. Tan Gushin ate half of it, and Lee Mi-on naturally took the other half, laughing. "Lucky it's a persimmon. Pears wouldn't work. Can't share a pear." Tan Gushin kicked him. "You think too much." Lee Mi-on sighed. "It's almost 12. Shouldn't the old lady be going to bed?" Tan Gushin replied, "You underestimate her." Lee Mi-on, who had long been accustomed to Tan Gushin's cold demeanor at work, now saw her acting sneakily, which was quite lively. They hadn't left the house all day, hiding in the dark as if pretending Tan Gushin was out of town to avoid her mother. Tan Gushin said, "The last time I said I wasn't home, she went to stand by the water and electricity meter for 5 hours. In the end, I gave myself away by the power usage." Lee Mi-on laughed. "Is she still afraid of her mother at over 40? Tan Gushin said, "You should ask her why at 70. She's still such a fool."
Lee Mi-on asked,
"How so?" Tan Gushin stretched her body, leaning on the sofa with a somewhat disdainful tone. "She and the lady from the Guan family converted to a religion. She didn't trust that I'd be alone in hell, so she did everything she could to preach to me. Ever since then, I've refused to meet either of them in private, otherwise, even breathing would be considered a sin." Lee Mi-on couldn't help but laugh, though it was too soon. The next morning, there was a continuous chorus of songs from downstairs. Lee Mi-on recalled Tan Gushin's words, staying alert. He peeked through the curtain and saw a group of middle-aged and older people swaying in the yard like grass in the wind. Tan Gushin said from behind, "You're awake?" Lee Mi-on pointed outside, and Tan Gushin said, "The local choir, it's the first time they've come so early."
Lee Mi-on asked,
"Did they come to sing in someone else's yard?" Tan Gushin laughed. "Whose yard?" Lee Mi-on focused, and indeed recognized a familiar face. Turning back, he smiled. "Your mother has quite the taste." Tan Gushin replied. "She went on a trip with this group of brothers and sisters before. Now she's back, focusing on purifying my soul again."
Lee Mi-on asked,
"Didn't she believe you were out of town yesterday?" Tan Gushin furrowed her brows. "She probably asked the Guan family mother and son. They're so annoying." Lee Mi-on suddenly noticed someone sneaking into the corner, their sneaky appearance making his heart race. It felt like an eternity before his scattered thoughts returned, piecing together his fragmented soul. He turned back and forced a smile at Tan Gushin. "A lot of things are missing at home. I'll go out shopping today." Tan Gushin, without suspicion, said, "Go ahead, but don't get stuck at the door." Flies and mice possess the largest internet in the city, foul-smelling and filthy, but in the instant their noses meet, they exchange billions of bits of information. Lee Mi-on was driving Tan Gushin's car. As he passed by that man, he lowered the window, immediately seeing the man winking happily, rubbing his hands, and about to grab the car door. Lee Mi-on barked, "Hands off." The man was startled, his eyes darting around cautiously as he said, "There's no one here. Why are you yelling at your old man?" Lee Mi-on stared coldly. "The car's not mine. Don't dirty this spot. If you can keep up running behind, it'll be your luck." After driving about 5 kilometers, Lee Mi-on stopped the car, locked it, and sure enough, after a while, he saw the man running desperately to catch up, He was like a piece of sticky plaster, probably made with a dog's nose in his homemade concoction, so sensitive to the smell of money that he'd follow it from miles away. When the man caught up, he was bent over, panting heavily. You're something else, treating your father like this. Lee Mi-on coldly asked. How did you find me? Lee Da-fu grinned, his sharp white teeth nearly blue. You don't pay me. I can't just not see what's going on, right? Lee Mi-on said. I gave the living expenses to my mom. As for your gambling money, don't even think about asking me for it. Lee Da-fu's expression darkened. If you won't give it to me, I'll just ask my mother-in-law. I saw her this morning, a wealthy-looking old lady living in a villa. She must have a lot of money, right? Lee Mi-on calmly replied. Try asking her if she has the ability to squash you like the pest you are. Lee Da-fu, seeing that Lee Mi-on wasn't engaging, fumbled around in his pockets. His pants were old and worn, and his things had slipped into the inner layers. He stuck his arm all the way into his pants and rummaged around. Lee Mi-on felt disgusted, and Da-fu kept muttering. It's here somewhere. Why can't I find it? The guy said if you see this, you'll definitely fork out money. Lee Mi-on said. Dream on. Before he finished speaking, Lee Da-fu pulled out a large fish-like item and raised it triumphantly. Lee Mi-on's eyes were immediately drawn to it, and he had no choice but to look up, staring at the item. After a long moment, Lee Mi-on said emotionlessly, How much do you want? Lee Da-fu said, 100,000, no, 150,000. Lee Mi-on replied, 50,000. Lee Da-fu said, 200,000. Lee Mi-on couldn't stand it anymore. He grabbed his collar and punched him twice, making Da-fu unable to open his eyes. Da-fu stumbled backward, flailing and trying to fight back, tugging at Lee Mi-on's hair and kneeing him in the chest. Lee Mi-on seemed oblivious to the pain, relentlessly pounding his fists. Da-fu didn't expect such a strong reaction and couldn't handle it. He had no choice but to surrender. Take it, take it. I don't want the money anymore. Not a single cent. Lee Mi-on coughed and let him go. The watch had been thrown out of his hand, and as he picked it up from the ground, he wiped off the dust. He felt an odd sensation in his hand and turned it over, realizing the engraved G&T on the back. It was a memento from Tan Gushin. The engraving was fresh, a reminder that Guan Hashan had predicted he would cave in and had calculated every move, ensuring Lee Mi-on could never get what he wanted. It was a distasteful thing to hold, but too valuable to discard. Da-fu, now disheveled, stood up and glared at Lee Mi-on. He didn't say anything but gritted his teeth like a wolf, turning and limping away. Lee Mi-on took a moment to catch his breath, went back to the car, and lowered the sun visor, preparing to fix his appearance. That's when he noticed his face was streaked with tears. By the time Lee Mi-on returned home, it was almost noon. Tan Gushin was on a work call. Lee Mi-on grabbed her other hand and rubbed his cheek against it. Tan Gushin, annoyed, smacked him lightly, and he smiled before leaving. They had lunch together. Tan Gushin said, The faculty hiring plan for this year has been approved. Have you reviewed the materials for the joint exams? Lee Mi-on smiled. You're so good to me. Tan Gushin shook her head. It's not so absolute. You need to pay more attention to it yourself. She glanced at him, then smiled. Don't expect to rely on your looks to get by everywhere. Lee Mi-on lowered his head, quietly eating his rice. As long as you still want me, I'll only use my looks on you. Tan Gushin clicked her tongue, reaching out. Lee Mi-on instinctively leaned over, resting his chin in her palm, his eyes soft like a lamb, unaware, trying to nibble at the bare land. On Monday, when Lee Mi-on went back to work, he felt the same malicious glee in the eyes of others. He was startled and excused himself to the archives room, leaning against the cold metal cabinet, reflecting on the situation. Footsteps approached, and Guan Hashan rounded the corner, walking slowly to face him. Mr. E, looking for this? The cabinet blocked the light, and the air in the dim room was thick with the smell of old paper. Guan Hashan handed Yi Mian an envelope, then casually put his hands in his pockets, waiting for him to open it. Though he tried to seem calm, Guan Hashan's pupils betrayed his excitement. Yi Mian suppressed his unease and opened the envelope. It was a handwritten letter. As he read, a pain like a nightmare slowly crept up his skin, and the world around him seemed to empty, leaving him off balance and unsure of where to stand. Guan Hashan held the top of the letter, smiling as he slowly read it aloud. I, Idafu, officially report that my eldest son, Yi Mian, has been maintaining an improper relationship with school leaders for personal gain and has been involved in academic misconduct. His graduate thesis in 2019 was actually written by Zhang Yiming, a current student at the time. Here's a copy of it, Mr. Yi. Want to guess where the original is? Yi Mian felt as if two versions of himself existed. One was fearful, the other smirking. Guan, your writing is pretty good. Guan Hashan replied. Mr. Yi, don't be so stubborn now. Yi Mian said. I trust Dean Tan. Guan Hashan laughed so hard that his shoulders shook. Mr. Yi, what does any of this have to do with Dean Tan? She's unmarried, so no improper relationship. As for the academic misconduct, that's just old baggage between you and Shen Honglu. Do you really think she'd protect you with such a huge issue? His laughter was so wild that it took him a while to regain his composure. He slapped Yi Mian's shoulder with force. Of course, she might protect you, but you'd better not think too much about it. People like us just don't like being controlled, and neither does she. Yi Mian shoved him away, took a few steps, and then turned back. Get out. Guan Hashan wasn't bothered. As he left, he cheerfully closed the door, making it slam loudly. Dust on the shelf jumped, some falling to the ground. Yi Mian stayed in the archives all day, feeling that overwhelming sense of pressure once again. He was like a balloon, with others' gazes inflating him. He didn't want to go down without a fight, but there was no way to avoid it forever. Even canned food had to be opened eventually. He told Tangushin he had something to do and stayed until it was dark. But as he wandered, he still found himself heading to one place, the one place he hesitated to go, sneaking toward Tangushin's home. Out of nowhere, someone splashed cold water in his face. Shocked, he looked up and saw Tangushin's mother holding a silver cross around her neck. Furiously, the old lady rushed at him like an angry hen. You devil, stay away from my daughter. The light in the living room on the second floor snapped on with a loud click. Tangushin, wearing pajamas and slippers, walked out onto the balcony, her tone cold. What's going on now? Yi Mian lowered his head as Tan's mother jabbed her finger forcefully into his forehead, exasperated. A person like this, someone like this, you're bringing him into the house? You're a girl. Don't you have any self-respect? God, you're going to hell for this. Tangushin replied. Get out. Tan's mother froze for a moment, trembling with anger. She threw a piece of paper, the sound of it swishing through the air. Look at this. Look at this. Even his own parents can't stand him, and you treat him like treasure. Tangushin said. First, there's no such thing as treasure here. Second, get out of my house or I'll call the police. Third. She paused, leaning her arm on the railing, looking at her mother with a smile. My own mother thought I was filthy and stupid, so I have no ground to criticize him on this. Yi Mian finally entered the room. Tangushin threw him a towel, saying simply, I'm hungry. His hands shook violently, and he made a bowl of noodles for her, then brought it over. Tangushin, puzzled, asked, Aren't you eating? Yi Mian's throat was tight. He forced a smile. I've caused such a big mess. I came back to hear your instructions. Tangushin just smiled, set her chopsticks down, leaned back in her chair, and thought for a moment. Then, she smiled again and pointed to another chair. Sit. She began speaking slowly. Guan Hashan has a problem, one that most PhDs in ivory towers have. Half of them are students, but the other half are socially immature, constantly speculating about how the world works based on assumptions. This letter doesn't affect you, unless you still care about your already ruined reputation. In any public scandal, it's never the ones with nothing to lose who are affected. Of course, this won't cause any trouble for me. They'll just think my private life is a bit unkempt. But for Shun Honglu, she has to hide the two big stains: marital infidelity and academic dishonesty. Just relax. She'll have to pull herself out of the mud, and of course, she'll drag you along with her. Lee Mian suddenly felt the blood returning to his body. So, you mean? Tan Guxin smiled. Dean Shun is getting promoted, lower levels recommending her, upper levels reviewing her, leadership backing her. If her huge scandals break now, do you think it's just her problem? Lee Mian squatted beside her, and Tan Guxin squeezed the back of his neck, forcing him to look up. He saw his own pale lips, the fear still lingering in his eyes, and her sigh. To be this scared, you should be thanking your face. Otherwise, you should be displayed in a museum so elementary school kids can see what a fool looks like. Lee Mian didn't speak. Tan Guxin said, "Don't get it? No matter, it's the price for taking shortcuts." Her hand was cold as it gently stroked the back of his neck. Lee Mian felt a lump in his throat, a cry trapped inside, eager to get out. But no matter how hard he tried, it was stuck, like a heart stuck in his throat, beating desperately but unable to find release. Tan Guxin pulled her hand away and started eating. She finished her meal and said, "You're only suited to be a good dog. Don't doubt your master." 2 days later, Tan Guxin told him to wait downstairs by the administrative building after work. Lee Mian obediently followed, but from the corner of his eye, he saw Guan Hashan approaching. Without thinking, he straightened his back, transforming from casually fiddling with his phone to pretending to play with it. Guan Hashan hadn't used hair gel, looking somewhat disheveled. His hair was tousled, his face pale, and he wore a white polo shirt with gray pants. Lee Mian couldn't help but glance at him a couple of times. Guan Hashan was about to glare at him but deflated halfway through, instead giving him a resentful look. Tan Guxin's car stopped at the foot of the stairs. Both of them went to open the passenger door, but Tan Guxin pressed the window button and said coldly, "Sit in the back." They both stood by their respective doors, practically wanting to draw a dividing line between them, but Tan Guxin didn't pay attention to their silent battle. "Little Guan, have you thought about how you're going to explain this to them?" Guan Hashan didn't answer, just pressed his lips together. Tan Guxin glanced in the rearview mirror and casually tossed some foundation at Lee Mian. "Not wearing makeup today?" Lee Mian noticed that the foundation was new, and also saw that Tan Guxin had a few white hairs on her head that she didn't bother to hide. The car entered the restaurant's parking lot. Before getting out, Tan Guxin checked Lee Mian's appearance, touched up his eyebrows, then turned to Guan Hashan. "Don't put on that dead look. You're here to apologize." Guan Hashan gritted his teeth. "Why should I?" Tan Guxin replied, "Because one word from her could ruin your 4 years of PhD studies. Is that enough?" Lee Mian saw that Guan Hashan wiped his eyes behind Tan Guxin. She grabbed her bag from the car and pointed at Guan Hashan. "I'm telling you, if you weren't my student, you wouldn't even have the chance to apologize." They hurriedly followed Tan Guxin down the splendid hallway. A waiter smiled and opened the private room door. Lee Mian glanced at a familiar face and quickly lowered his head. Tan Guxin smiled and walked up. "Secretary Shin, sorry for the delay. Traffic was terrible. I'll start by having 3 drinks as punishment." Lee Mian saw Tan Guxin motion with her left hand behind her back, and Guan Hashan stepped forward, raising his glass and drinking 3 shots in one go. Shun Honglu didn't stop him. At this point, everyone's eyes landed on Lee Mian. Tan Guxin smiled. "He still can't drink. Please spare him, Secretary Shin." Shun Honglu smiled back. "Dean Tan, looks like you didn't teach him well." Tan Guxin laughed. "Drinking harms the skin, and in the end, I'll be the one paying to take care of him. No need to teach him this." Shun Honglu smiled. "True enough." She patted the seat beside her. Come, shall Mion sit here? Mion hesitated and looked at Tangushin, only to find she didn't spare him a second glance. He shuffled forward, sitting awkwardly like a primary school student, hands folded neatly on his lap. Shun Honglu nostalgically placed her hand over his, and he froze, his body shuddering. Yet she continued to stroke him. From the back of his hand to his palm, then his hair and cheek, and back to his hand. She held one of his hands with both of hers, the unpleasant scent and warmth making him tremble, his eyes seeking Tangushin. Shun Honglu smiled. What's the matter? So scared. This isn't your fault. Look at me and Dean Tan, who said anything to you? His desperate gaze met Tangushin's smile, and she smiled back. You and Secretary Shun are old friends. What's there to be afraid of? Mion's back suddenly felt cold. He had once belonged to them, and now he could never fight back. At any time, they could use the power they had over him, never understanding why he might refuse. As if his will, at this moment, was meaningless. After some more casual chatter, Guan Hashan stood up, filled a large glass, and walked to Shun Honglio's side, holding it out. Secretary Shun. Shun Honglu didn't look up. Guan Hashan bent down and said, Secretary Shun, I was confused for a moment. I shouldn't have caused you trouble. Please, on behalf of Dean Tan, give me this chance. I'll be forever grateful. This drink is for you. All my sincerity is in it. Guan Hashan drank 2 shots in one go. Only then did Shun Honglu glance at him and smile. My glass was too much. Shall Mion give me yours? Shun Honglu took Mion's glass. He was about to protest, but stopped himself. There's lipstick on it. His lip print was left on the glass. Shun Honglu smiled at him, turned the glass around, then took a sip from where his print was, and handed it back to him. Finish the rest for me. Mion stiffly drank the rest of the alcohol, and only then did Shun Honglu smile at Guan Hashan. All right, it seems Dean Tan has these 2 handsome boys fighting for her attention. She's lucky. But you two should stop being so reckless from now on, understand? Guan Hashan replied. Yes, you're right. Shun Honglu continued. Now drink another one for your teacher. She's been so caring for you. Don't go looking for trouble with her. Tangushin quickly stood up, smiling. Secretary Shun, you're too kind. On the way back, they hired a designated driver. Guan Hashan was drunk and fell asleep as soon as he got into the car. Mion stared blankly out the window, faintly smelling the alcohol on his body and the lingering scent of Shun Honglio's perfume. Tangushin patted him. Feeling uncomfortable? I have some hangover medicine at home. You can take some when we get back. Mion shifted to the left, unwilling to sit next to her, not speaking. Tangushin laughed, reaching out to pull him close. Not happy. She was also soaked in alcohol. Her warm, moist lips brushed his ear. He widened his eyes. She touched my hand. Tangushin smiled. Where hasn't she touched you? Mion urgently retorted. That's different. Tangushin asked. How is it different? Mion fell silent, engulfed in a vast despair. He couldn't untangle the mess in his mind. He didn't know where to start if he wanted Tangushin to understand. He couldn't sort it out or cut it off. He just stared out the window, numb and fearful, watching the neon lights flicker. Tangushin kissed his cheek. All right, I don't mind. This is all in the past. Cheer up. Mion quietly responded after a long pause. Yes. He was still the beautiful bird she didn't care about, a pawn in her hands. From then on, Guan Hashan fell silent, and it was said that he began focusing on preparing his graduation thesis. During graduation season, Tangushin became busy, going out early and returning late. Mion spent more time alone at home, and for the first time, he realized how quiet and empty the villa felt. One day, he met a neighbor walking their dog, a strong yellow dog with shiny fur. Mion smiled at the dog, and it immediately ran over, happily sitting at his feet. The owner jogged over and laughed. "I told you to pet it. This dog, it knows who likes it and who doesn't." Emion tried petting its head, and it was soft like satin. He could hear the dog's panting and couldn't help but pet its nose too. The yellow dog licked his hand with its warm tongue. Emion was ticklish, tried to pull away, but didn't want to hurt the dog's feelings. "Egg yolk, don't lick. Egg yolk is bad. Egg yolk is bad." The dog owner saw his discomfort and gave the dog a light smack on the head, saying, "It's like this. Its saliva is everywhere." Last time, a little girl petted it, and it sneakily stole her bag charm and held it in its mouth. By the time she noticed, it had sucked on it completely.
Disgusting, right?
Stinky dog. Egg yolk, after being slapped, still foolishly grinned. Emion laughed and said, "Now I feel like I want to get a dog too. It's so lonely at home." Just as the words left his mouth, he suddenly changed his expression, realizing why Tengushin had so easily accepted him. After a few more pleasantries, he used the excuse that the soup was still simmering on the stove and quickly stood up to leave, almost running home. Tengushin was still busy, and Emion couldn't sleep for a few days. One morning, Tengushin saw him, paused for a moment, then casually handed him a card. Emion looked at the words "Guishing Aesthetic Medical" on it and subconsciously touched his cheek.
He too had this day.
Sensing the mood, he said, "Director Tan, I'd like to request a week off." That week, he had been involved in several projects, some of which required manual needlework. At first, it was fine, but later, the pain intensified. Dizzy, he thought he had never realized how much area his face covered and how many needles could be inserted into it. The effect was indeed remarkable. After the swelling went down, Tengushin's gaze toward him became more appreciative, and he suddenly had one of her precious nights. Once again, he could be her dog, lying on top of her, kissing her shoulder and neck inch by inch, nearly pressing his lips against hers. But then, a phone call came for help. A graduate student of Tengushin's had climbed up to the rooftop of a teaching building in the dead of night, swaying dangerously. By the time they arrived, the firefighter's air cushion had been laid out, and there were already firefighters standing guard. The student stood at the edge of the rooftop, his backpack on, silent despite the rescuers offering various conditions. One firefighter quietly spoke to the two of them. "We need someone from the school to go up and distract him, so we can rescue him." Tengushin, for some reason, adjusted Emion's collar. "You go." The elevator reached the 9th floor, and Emion, along with a firefighter, climbed up to the rooftop. The firefighter cautiously approached. "Student, could you talk to us, please?" Emion felt his throat tighten, but he understood why Tengushin had called him. "Student, any problem at school can be solved. Actually, when I was in grad school, I even hired someone to write my thesis. Think about it. Someone like me is still alive. What are you afraid of?" The student's gaze slowly focused on him, as if trying to see Emion's face. The firefighter squeezed Emion's arm, signaling him to continue. Emion continued. "Just come down first. Graduation matters can all be settled. I can make decisions for Director Tan. I'll promise you on her behalf that you'll graduate on time. Is that okay?" The student, voice cracking, asked, "Do you have the final say?" Emion replied, "I do. I'll have her talk to you right now, okay?" He sent a message to Tengushin and saw someone handing her a megaphone. Her voice came through. "Zhou Haoran, if you come down today, I can guarantee you graduate on time. Don't gamble with your life." Zhou Haoran froze at these words. After a long while, he turned around with a grim smile. "But this makes me realize that I'm truly useless, relying on threats and others' pity just to graduate." He bent his body slightly. The firefighter rushed forward, tightly grabbing his legs midair, but the student suddenly jerked his upper body, sending his backpack and outer clothing flying. His forehead hit the railing with a loud thud. Emion, holding his breath, finally relaxed. Only then did he feel the cold. The collar that Tengushin had adjusted for him seemed to have frozen, and it didn't come undone. He rubbed his hands together and quickly walked downstairs. He had a joke to tell her, a joke only foolish students would understand. Of course, he also had complaints. Zhou Haoran reflected his better side in the mirror, unable to find a way out, willing to die rather than accept pity from others. But the mirror also showed his worst side, where a bit of pressure could make his dignity crumble, flattering those above and bullying those below, twisting and begging to change to a comfortable nest. He felt shame, and so resentment grew. Resentful that she had called him, and even more resentful that he understood her intentions from just 3 words. She wanted him to show his weakest side to comfort someone else. Mian walked out of the teaching building and saw that the ambulance hadn't left yet, but the stretcher had been rolled out, and someone was lying on it. He suddenly froze. A nightmarish pain and coldness, emptiness swept over him again, even more vicious than the first time, chilling him to the bone. The injured person was Tan Guxin. Zhou Haoran's phone was thrown from the 8th floor and hit Tan Guxin in the face. When Yumian climbed into the ambulance, medical staff had already covered her eyes with gauze. As soon as Yumian spoke, he felt the whole world was shaking. Tan Guxin didn't say anything but blindly groped with her right hand. He quickly held it, only to find that her grip was incredibly strong. She grabbed his hand tightly, her palms soaked with sweat, her nails digging in, turning blue. He knelt beside the stretcher, pressing her hand to his forehead, softly saying, "Tan Yuan, I'm here. I'm not leaving. I'll go to the hospital with you." The medical staff were busy with equipment and had stern faces. The victim's eyeball suffered external injuries, and the situation is quite serious. She'll definitely need surgery when we get to the hospital. Are you her colleague? Please notify her family as soon as possible. This matter cannot be delayed. Yumian noticed Tan Guxin's grip tightening on his hand and heard her say, "He's my family." An inappropriately timed, almost painful feeling of happiness surged within him. He suddenly had an identity, had recognition, but at this moment, Tan Guxin's eyeballs were injured to varying degrees. After the surgery, she had to remain in a prone position for a month and could not be exposed to light. Their identities shifted unexpectedly. Yumian became her protector. The school leadership came to visit. They surrounded the bed, but Tan Guxin could only lie down. The atmosphere was awkward, and Yumian had to force a smile as he intervened. He said, "Principal Fu, Tan Yuan is still in the recovery phase. The doctors say the prognosis is good, and her eyesight won't be affected." Principal Fu nodded, but didn't look him in the eye. Yumian felt like his entire being was being scrutinized, though the gaze was full of confusion. Tan Guxin said, "This is our college's administrator, Teacher Yi." Principal Fu said, "Good. You were injured for the students. It's only right that the school sends people to take care of you. Teacher Yi, you're in charge of Tan Yuan for the next few months." Yumian didn't respond. After the principal left, he smiled with a tinge of bitterness. "Looks like I've been sent here on official business." Tan Guxin smiled and said, "You think I don't know? I'm just giving you some face. You don't realize your own fame, do you?" Yumian replied, "So, am I embarrassing you here?" Tan Guxin didn't speak. After a long pause, she simply said, "My back hurts." Yumian responded, "You've been lying like this for 24 hours. How could it not hurt?" He spoke while helping her massage her back. As he did so, his heart slowly sank. He realized that he was dangerously falling into this situation, like the beautiful yet sorrowful doll of a Japanese woman lying on a tatami mat, her mouth full of resentment, but her heart full of love. Tan Guxin had never been so tolerant of him, and he knew it was simply an instinctive reaction to the current situation. In an instant, Yumian wished he could remain in this moment forever. Tan Guxin was always fragile, always relying on him, having to suppress the sharp edges of her power and wealth. Ultimately, did she have a bit of real affection for him? She would rather have him by her side than seek help from her mother or from Guan Heshan. She trusted him. But still, she still felt ashamed to say it. Once again, she said, he was her family. Her true feelings only surfaced fleetingly in moments of fear and then disappeared as quickly as they came. He should have understood. She treated him like a dog, letting others touch him casually.
She had always treated him this way.
Yumian suddenly withdrew his hand, his fingers burning with his own thoughts, so real that his fingertips actually felt scorched. He stood frozen, stunned. He forced a smile and said, "Tan Yuan, should I read you a book?" Tan Guxin replied, "Sure." Now, she was indifferent to everything. Yumian casually picked a book from the shelf. The cover had faded, like the face of a woman from the fortress, and he wiped it with a warm towel. When he opened it, he realized it was a book by Zhang Ailing. He softly said, "Love in a Fallen City." Tan Guxin sighed. "I read this when I was in middle school." Yumian replied, "I've never read it." He began reading aloud to Tan Guxin, but behind him, there was a strange, uninvited laughter. His shadow, like a ghost, coldly pressed against him, forced out by the story. His shadow, by Liu Su's shadow, clashed when they reached the part where Liu Su looked in the mirror, suspecting her aging. Yumian was defeated. He suddenly slammed the book shut, gasping for air. Bai Liu Su was a lady, but he was a courtesan. Tan Guxin remained quiet, lying still, not urging him to continue. He took a moment to compose himself, but grew increasingly unsettled as he read, not understanding why his own life felt like it was reflected in the story from over 80 years ago. The sun began to set. Tan Guxin remained still. After a while, Yumian wondered if she had passed away, but just as he was reading about the outbreak of war in Hong Kong, Liu Su and Lu Yuan were taking shelter under fire. Liu Su told Fan Lu Yuan, "If I die, my story is over." It seemed as if it didn't matter to him either. When Tan Guxin's story ended, his too seemed to end alongside it. Yumian asked, "Tan Yuan, are you hungry?" Tan Guxin replied, "A little." Yumian set the book down and said, "Then I'll make dinner." He ran away, casually putting the book on the table, folding a page. The story was nearing its conclusion. Liu Su had become Lu Yuan's wife, smiling as she lit incense in their home. She had been fulfilled through war, seeing the future through the lens of a city, which had given her everything. Even though she had gained the marriage of a charming gentleman, Liu Su did not feel like she was a legend. Yumian soaked vegetables in water, watching little bubbles rise to the surface, as if the vegetables were breathing. Suddenly, he felt a surge of anger and wanted to drown them. The shock of war had brought Liu Su and Lu Yuan together, just as Tan Guxin's injury had bound her to him. But this was false. She was suddenly trapped, becoming nothing more than Tan Guxin herself. But eventually, she would heal and gradually return to her original path. There, he could only call her Tan Yuan. They were still as distant as the first day they met. All the love was one-sided, from him alone. He froze for a moment, realizing that there were not only small bubbles in the water, but also ripples, suddenly appearing and spreading outward, crashing against the edge of the basin. He looked down, and in the reflection, there was a beautiful face, full of sorrow and endless sadness. It was then he realized he had been crying.